The title of my presentation, as you can see, is Between War and Peace, Legal Assessment of Hybrid Threats and Warfare. And that's the official title. I have a less official title as well, and that's the Schrödinger's War. For those of you who have heard about the experiment, the connection might already be pretty obvious. But for those of you who haven't, I will try to explain at the end of my presentation. In my research in the project, I was aiming to analyze hybrid threats and warfare under the international public law and EU law to determine what legal consequences can be triggered by hybrid threats and campaigns, whether they trigger a legal regime applicable to armed conflict or not. And the overarching goal was to determine the scope of lawful countermeasures that can be applied to counter hybrid threats and attacks. So my presentation unfolds in the following way. First, I'm going to address the notion and origin of hybrid conflicts. Then I'm going to present the legal assessment. And at the end, I'm trying to formulate some final thoughts. As for the legal assessment, in my written contribution, I carried out a legal assessment under the public international law and EU policies as well. But during today's presentation, I'm only going to refer to the public international law, more precisely to the law on the use of force, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. So first, let's take a look at the notion of hybrid threats and warfare. So first of all, it's definitely not a legal term, and there is not even a universally agreed definition or common understanding as to what hybrid threats and warfare are. And in fact, there are many names which try to describe the same thing, the same notion. So we have a list here. I have come across the following expressions: ambiguous warfare, gray zone warfare, sub-threshold warfare. It seems that the most popular is hybrid warfare and hybrid threats. The EU documents usually use the expression hybrid threats or hybrid campaigns, while the NATO documents refer to the hybrid warfare. Personally, I will use these terms interchangeably. As for my research, the denomination was of less importance. It is believed that the first definition was coined by Frank Hoffman about 20 years ago, who referred to the blurring of modes of war, the blurring of who fights and what techniques and technologies are used. Since Hoffman, many other definitions have been proposed by military and legal scholars as well. That isn't really helpful for the research, but I realized that all of the definitions try to capture the essence, and they all point to the combination of various kinetic and non-kinetic means on land, sea, and air, including overt and covert operations. And here you have a list, a non-exhaustive list of tactics that are used, such as the use of unmarked special forces, using information warfare, about which my partner in crime was brilliantly speaking a moment ago. Cyber attacks. We also heard yesterday that everything can be weaponized. So food can be weaponized, energy can be weaponized. Also law can be weaponized, and in the context of hybrid war, we often refer to the lawfare, which is the weaponization of war. There is also an expression of a coercive engineered migration, which means the weaponization of migrants, recently seen and applied in Europe. The question is whether it is a new type of warfare, or is it, or it's not. Some authors, in fact, many authors, consider the 2014 Russian campaign in Ukraine as the archetypical example of hybrid warfare. For the already mentioned Frank Hoffman, the classic example of hybrid war was the 2006 conflict in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. On the other hand, for the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the hybrid war is as old as the Trojan horse. So as you can see, the debate is ongoing. Anyway, it deserves some explanations why we are discussing the hybrid war among the most advanced military technologies, such as AI, drones and robots, space technologies, if hybrid war isn't really about cutting-edge military technologies. Well, so regardless of this ongoing military debate, I believe that hybrid warfare actually is a product of the late 20th century and the beginning of 21st century, in the sense that it thrives on the instrumentalization of public international law. It exploits the concepts such as the prohibition of the use of force, the right to self-defense, which form part of the international system of war prevention established under the UN Charter. As Kai already mentioned, these legal concepts are very difficult to determine, to interpret, and they depend on different thresholds, interpretations, which are not entirely clear. And so is the international humanitarian law and international human rights law. They all add to the complexity, and they create such a legal matrix which is a breeding ground for hybrid threats and warfare. We can say that the distinctive feature of hybrid warfare is the legal imbalance between democratic states, who are law-abiding states, and autocratic states or non-state actors, who are less concerned about the rule of law and fair play. It also means that the international law is used by hybrid adversaries to gain advantage over democratic states, because, as we will see, operationally, international law favors hybrid aggressors by limiting the possible lawful countermeasures that law-abiding states can resort to. Another reason why we can think about hybrid war in terms of novelty is that its emergence is closely linked to the shift in the geopolitical landscape. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it was presented yesterday by Anna Molnar, this transition from the bipolar world order after the Second World War to the unipolar world order after 1991. Anna explained that now we are somewhere in the complex multipolarity, and I believe that the emergence of the hybrid war was a tool used by the, let's say, revisionist powers who are seeking to challenge the unipolar world order, and they were using tactics that were so-called dark reflection of the NATO's comprehensive approach to maintain global peace and stability. And especially the 1999 Kosovo campaign was used by the non-Western powers as an example of a unilateral and discretionary interpretation of the UN Charter. That gave rise and ground for the hybrid threats. So I hope that this maybe a little bit lengthy introduction will allow us to better understand the idea and the novelty of the hybrid war. And now let me turn to the legal assessment, to the part of the legal assessment. So Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, mentioned already by Miha, it lays down the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. And as Miha already told us, that according to the prevalent interpretation, the prohibition of the use of force refers to armed force, to military force. So while hybrid campaigns that involve violent military acts can rather easily be classified as the illegal use of force under the UN Charter. And that was the example of the 2014 hybrid campaign in Crimea. So at the same time, classifying hybrid campaigns which do not involve violent military acts as the use of force would be contrary, according to the prevailing interpretation of the Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. And since cyber attacks often form part of the hybrid tactics, hybrid warfare, I also mentioned them here, and that is true that the weapon-like destructive potential of cyber attacks has recently been receiving more and more consideration. And according to my research, the destructive potential of cyber attacks can legitimize, in theory, can legitimize an exception to the narrow interpretation of the term use of force used in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. And then turning to the right to self-defense, guaranteed in Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is a lawful exemption to the prohibition of the use of force. It also raises many interpretational questions, and the threshold used in Article 51, which links the right to individual or collective self-defense to the occurrence of an armed attack, is higher. It is believed to be higher than the threshold for the use of force under Article 2, Paragraph 4. So while it is already difficult to classify hybrid attacks as the use of force, it is even more difficult to conclude that hybrid attacks can enable the right to self-defense. And the most prominent feature, the key feature of most hybrid attacks, is that they actually remain below the threshold of the armed conflict, and therefore they do not enable the right to self-defense within the meaning of Article 51 of the Charter or Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, because hybrid adversaries deliberately act at such a level of intensity which normally does not allow the targeted state to use forcible measures in self-defense. That is why I prefer personally the term sub-threshold war than hybrid war, because I think it somehow better captures the essence of this way of waging conflicts. After the 2014 Russian hybrid operation in Ukraine, NATO has declared that hybrid operations could reach the level of armed attack and lead to the invocation of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty and the collective self-defense mechanism. However, for me it is not clear whether such operations would require any violent acts by hybrid adversaries to trigger the NATO's collective defense mechanism, or non-violent, non-kinetic operations would also allow to the activation of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. In any other cases, states affected by hybrid threats below the threshold of armed attack can only resort to non-forcible countermeasures and peacetime regulations. Let's take a look at the international humanitarian law, which is a vast body of public international law composed of customary law and treaty law as well. For the sake of simplicity, I chose only to refer here to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. And the common Article 2 of the Geneva Conventions stipulate that they apply to all cases of declared war or any other armed conflict, even if the state of war is not recognized by the parties. In other words, the international humanitarian law, which governs the conduct of hostilities during an armed conflict, shall apply regardless of the legality of the armed conflict, no matter if the use of force is lawful in terms of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, Article 51, because it is the factual hostilities, factual existence of an armed conflict that triggers the international humanitarian law. And while it may seem easier than the interpretation of the UN Charter, still the nature of hybrid conflicts, which blur, which combine different methods, kinetic and non-kinetic means of warfare, makes it very difficult to determine whether hybrid conflicts activate the application of international humanitarian law, and even if they do, whether they trigger the regime applicable to international or non-international armed conflicts, which is not without significance for the scope of applicable provisions. And I'm very grateful to Fokaya for explaining that in more detail in her presentation, so I don't have to. And as we have heard from Michal a couple of moments ago, the 1949 Geneva Conventions were drafted at the time where kinetic warfare was prevailing. And currently there is no legal basis to establish that hybrid conflicts which do not involve violent actions trigger the application of the Geneva Conventions. Nevertheless, the International Committee of the Red Cross has started to consider the impact of new technologies for the application of international humanitarian law. And 2016 commentary of the International Committee of the Red Cross, I refer to that commentary because it states that cyber operations which have similar effects to classic kinetic operations, that means, for example, which result in the destruction of civilian or military infrastructure or cause the death or injury of soldiers or civilians, can amount to an armed conflict and shall be treated the same way as classic military operations from the point of view of the application of international humanitarian law. However, it is not clear how to treat low intensity operations which do not physically destroy military or civilian infrastructure or does not cause death or injury of soldiers or civilians, but for example only disrupt the operation of critical infrastructure. So for the time being these questions are left open and the legal framework is uncertain on that subject. And the last part of the legal assessment here in my presentation, it's the legal assessment of hybrid threats and warfare from the point of view of international human rights law and the regulations allowing for restrictions of human rights and freedoms. I would like to note that the relevant legal regime which regulates the restrictions and derogations of human rights obligations. In this context, they are anchored both in the international humanitarian law and human rights law. And we can say that hybrid attacks can prompt different consequences depending on whether they occur in times of armed conflict, in times of public emergency, other than armed conflict, or in peacetime. So the scope of possible derogations and limitations is different. Also, the applicability of international human rights law as lex specialis to human rights law is different in every case. And I analyzed that in great detail in my written contribution. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Also, I analyzed the derogations notified by Ukraine after the 2014 Russian aggression, because Ukraine more than 20 times derogated from its human rights obligations under the international covenant on political and civil. Oh my God. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and European Convention on Human Rights, and it's very interesting to take a look at the justification and also at the assessment of the European Council, for example. Anyway, the research on the hybrid threats in relation to international human rights law reflects the main challenges of countering hybrid threats and warfare under the human rights paradigm. It's not surprisingly that the legal qualification of hybrid attacks as an armed conflict, state of emergency, or peacetime is of primary importance and of main challenge, and so is the balancing of the interests of national security and state sovereignty with the enjoyment of human rights and freedoms. So a couple of final thoughts. I don't dare to say conclusions because so far I believe it is not possible to conclude whether hybrid attacks amount to factual combat, whether they are equal to the use of force, and whether they trigger legal consequences attached to the existence of armed conflicts, such as the right to self-defense or the application of international humanitarian law. So, some of you might feel disappointed after my presentation. You have every right to if you expected clear-cut answers and clear legal assessment. But I guess this lack of conclusion is also symptomatic and very indicative because it shows how the dichotomy between armed conflict and peace under the international public law does not actually correspond to the reality, to the realities of international relations and politics, and how it can become a vulnerability that is exploited by aggressors. So the question is whether the existing international legal framework shall be adopted to accommodate hybrid threats, whether we shall adopt some benchmarks or thresholds to better classify hybrid hostilities. Personally, I would opt against it because I think that negotiating on hypothetical thresholds could be impossible, if not even counterproductive, because even if we have some thresholds, there will always be space for sub-thresholds actions. Maybe creating common reference frame through, for example, simulations, common exercises for easier detection and classification of hybrid threats would be a better idea. So maybe one conclusion at the very end. By balancing between war and peace, I guess hybrid warfare can validly substitute for the Schrödinger's cat in the famous experiment, which is used to illustrate the principle of superposition in quantum mechanics. Definitely not my field of expertise, but I like the very idea of this thought experiment. So in simple terms, the experiment shown that if you put a cat in a windowless sealed box with something that can eventually kill it, such as a flask of poison activated by the decay of a radioactive substance, you won't know if the cat was dead or alive until you open that box. So until you open the box, the cat is at the same time dead and alive because its fate is linked to a random event that may or as well may not occur. So in my opinion, hybrid war is something similar, something like the Schrödinger's cat. So at the same time, it can be considered war and it can be considered peacetime. And the truth is that this experiment is sometimes used to illustrate how scientific theory works. And no one knows until no one knows if scientific theory is wrong or right until it is tested and proven. And I have a question. Do we really want to test if hybrid attacks amount to an armed conflict that can trigger the avalanche of a collective global response? And are we ready to open that box? Thank you.